Well, we're studying the Gospels. And I don't know about you, but I think you really can't beat the Gospels. Not just because it's the words of the Lord himself, but because they're full of surprises. They look so simple. The stories are easy for Sunday schools. But, you turn over one stone, you turn over a second stone, and all of a sudden you find a seam of gold. And every story you read, every parable you read, it's the same thing. You never ever quite get to the bottom or plumb the real depths of the Gospels, which appear to be so simple on the surface. But, and this is the but, it's not just the Gospels. We're dealing with characters in the Gospels. And the point of that is that these are now stories we can relate to at a very personal level. When we talk about the characters of the Gospels, there are, as you can see from this slide, there are about 60 characters, named or not, in the Gospel records themselves. Now, when you think about characters, you might think about the major characters, Peter, James, John, Mary, the Lord's mother, Caiaphas, Annas, people like that. Well, the fact is most of the characters are minor characters. What I've got on the screen here is the harmony of the 4 Gospel records, and I've poked in the 4 Passovers, which, because they're 1 year apart, show you really the 3.5 years of the Lord's ministry. And the 5 studies we've got ahead of us this week are going to consider those 5 names that I've highlighted in red in the Gospel records. So this morning, Jairus, the ruler of the Capernaum Synagogue, who, as we've read, had a little girl who was sick and who, in fact, died. Tomorrow morning, Mary and Martha, the sisters of Lazarus of Bethany. On Wednesday, the rich young ruler of Matthew chapter 19. This is a young man who had all the money in the world but was missing something, and he came to the Lord looking for the missing ingredient, looking for what he was lacking. And then on Thursday, Zacchaeus. Once again, a very simple story, a renowned story, a famous story. Here's a man who was also rich, and he also came to the Lord seeking something. And it appears, unlike the rich young ruler of Matthew 19, Zacchaeus found what he was looking for and responded. And then finally, on Friday morning, the parable of the Good Samaritan. Now, of course, the Good Samaritan is not one of the minor characters of the Gospels. He's a character of the parable. But that parable came about because a certain lawyer stood up in Luke chapter 10, and the lawyer is the minor character of the Gospels that you can see there with a red box around it. The lawyer received an answer to a question he asked. In fact, he received an answer to a different question, actually, to what he asked. But nevertheless, an answer that bewildered him, and if he had any honesty at all about him, which is by no means certain, that answer would have changed him. So there you are, 5 characters, 5, in fact, minor characters of the Gospels, but 5 exciting stories. And the thing, of course, about minor characters as opposed to major characters is that whilst we can all relate to character stories, we can relate even more to minor characters, can't we? I mean, if you or I, if the Lord came in the 21st century and walked around our streets, and 4 Gospels were written about his work in the 21st century, and all people were mentioned that, that he might have come into contact with, it's unlikely that would be one of the major characters of those stories. We ourselves would be the minor characters, the ordinary people of life who might find themselves in one of those Gospel stories. So the point is that these minor characters really are characters you can relate to, because they're characters from nowhere, really. They might only occur once in the record, and then they're gone. These are the kind of characters that we'd be. Well, Mark chapter 5 begins the first one for us this week, and that's the story of Jairus. And as we read, the story commences in Mark chapter 5 and in verse 21. Now, to put things in perspective, here's where he lived. This is Jairus, who it appears lived in Capernaum. Capernaum was a city on the northwest shore of the Sea of Galilee. And it tells us in verse 21 of Mark chapter 5 that when Jesus was passed over again by ship unto the other side, much people gathered unto him, and he was nigh unto the sea. Well, of course, the sea, as I say, is the Sea of Galilee. Jesus had just been in the Decapolis on the east, on the right-hand side of the sea, and he's just travelled across the sea to the western shore to Capernaum. Now, it doesn't say Capernaum here, but Matthew chapter 9 and verse 1 tells us that he passed over to the sea and he came to his own city. That's the parallel verse. He came to his own city, which we know was the city of Capernaum, the little fishing village on the northwest shore. Mark chapter 1 and verse 29 tells us that Simon and Andrew came from Capernaum. It was Capernaum that the Lord used as his headquarters for the entire epoch of time that he conducted his northern ministry. So it was an important city, not just in the region, but even in the Lord's own ministry. Well, verse 22 goes on and says that, behold, there cometh one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and when he saw the Lord, he fell down at his feet. Now, immediately in verse 22, we're introduced to the main character of our story. Jairus, the name Jairus, means enlightened or illuminated. It's the Greek form of the Hebrew Jair, or Jair, the judge of Judges 10 and verse 3. And it tells us here that he was a ruler of the synagogue, one of the rulers of the synagogue, but very likely the key man, a ruler of the synagogue. And we're going to suggest the Capernaum synagogue, therefore. Now, the rulers of the synagogues, or the job of the ruler of the synagogue, was some combination, you might say, of a chairman and a caretaker. It was his job to be responsible for the conducting of the synagogue worship, for the selection of those who might read or who might speak during that worship, as well as for the upkeep of the building itself. In general, he was responsible for the good order of everything that happened in that synagogue. And as far as this story is concerned, he's a representative, therefore, of the synagogue system. He's a representative of the law. Now, to understand just what position he might have occupied in society, you've got to understand something about the Jewish synagogue system of the first century. This is what a commentator tells us on the synagogue system. Now, here we go. It may be said, says Barclay, that the temple was the place of worship. Now, I've actually chopped off the right-hand side of my screen just a second with these pictures of people speaking. How do I? That'll do. That's better. It may be said that the temple was the place of worship and sacrifice. The synagogue was the place of teaching and instruction. The synagogue was by far the more influential. If a man had a new message to preach, the synagogue was the obvious place to preach it. When the people met at the synagogue service, it was open to the ruler of the synagogue to call on any competent person to give the address and the exposition. There was no professional ministry whatsoever. That's why Jesus was able to open his campaign in the synagogues. To the Jews, the most sacred thing in the world was the Torah, or the law of Moses. It contains direction and guidance for all life which must be brought out. To give this study and to supply this development, a class of scholars arose. These scholars were the scribes, the experts in the law. But no scribe ever gave a decision on his own. If he made a statement, he would buttress it with this, with that, with the next citation or quotation from the great legal masters of the past. The last thing he ever gave was an independent judgment. So that was the synagogue system. And that's, of course, you can see why it appealed to the Lord Jesus Christ to go to the synagogues to preach, in particular, as opposed to the temple. This is where hearts could be turned, because this was where the real influence was in Jewish social life. And Jairus was at the head of that system. And so you'll appreciate, therefore, that he wasn't just a routine member of society. He was influential in an influential part of Jewish society in the first century. But here's the interesting thing in verse 22. He's called Jairus by name, but he's never ever called Jairus by name ever again in this entire record. Throughout the rest of the record, he's called his title, the ruler of the synagogue. You'll see it in verse 35, verse 36, verse 38, the ruler of the synagogue, the ruler of the synagogue. Because he represented the system, you see. He represented the law of Moses. He represented everything that system stood for. The scribes, the Torah, everything it could do, and therefore everything it couldn't do. Well, we're going to see that here's a man whose name might mean illuminated, but in whose house was the darkness of death. You see, the problem with the synagogue system is that it didn't really illuminate anybody, because the law of Moses of itself couldn't save. It could only bring death. It could only expose sin. It could never forgive sin. And that's what we're going to be told in this story. Well, of course, Jairus is a very desperate man. It tells us at the end of verse 22, when he comes to the Lord, he falls at his feet. Now, that means that he fell prostrate at the Lord's feet. Now, you have to appreciate that as a ruler of the synagogue, occupying the position he occupied in society, this would have been a difficult thing to do. He would have been a man of dignity. He would have been a man of respect. He would have been a man that carried himself well, that spoke well. And he comes to Jesus as the Lord of life in this verse, clearly confessing that there's nothing that this synagogue could do for his daughter, who's about to lose her life. And it tells us in verse 23 that he besought the Lord greatly, saying, "My little daughter lieth at the point of death. I pray thee, come and lay thy hands on her, that she may be healed and that she may live." Now you think of that. He besought the Lord greatly. If there was anything the religious leaders were renowned for, it was their cold formality, their stiff upper lip. They had to maintain a certain aloofness from the population in order to control people. They couldn't be like one of the people. And you see, for this man, in order to change that, it's going to take a personal tragedy. It's going to take a personal tragedy. But now, time's running out quickly. And so the veneer is gone, the guards come down, and he's ready to learn something. And he says in verse 23, "My little daughter lieth at the point of death." Luke tells us in the parallel account in Luke chapter 8 and verse 42 that he had one only daughter and she lay dying. You might reason from that Jairus had a daughter and perhaps a number of sons, and this was his only daughter. Not true. The diaglott makes the point. He had an only daughter. It's the Greek word monogenes, only begotten. The same word used of the Lord Jesus Christ. This was his only begotten daughter. And so you appreciate this little girl was his life. This is pride and joy. I mean, he's invested everything in this kid. And she's at the point of death. Literally, it means she's at the extremity. Rotherham's translation says she's at her last. So she's in pain. You can appreciate it. She's breathing hard. Every breath's a struggle. The mother and the family are at the bedside. And there's nothing Dad can do. The ruler of the synagogue, there's nothing he can do. You know what his problem was? Or as it's characterized in this story, he thought the system could save his kids. And the system couldn't. He thought if he joined a good ecclesia, maybe he sent his kids to a Christadelphian school, maybe he helped with ecclesial working bees, maybe he's actively involved in committees, that the truth would naturally take care of itself and his family. Problem is that the system can't do that. As good as the systems are we have in ecclesial life, they can't save us and they can't save our children any more than the law of Moses could save people of itself. And the problem is that Jairus is part of the system. He worships the system. He thinks an awful lot of the system, but the system's letting him down. And it'll be the same for us. if our lives were characterized by ecclesial service, but not by a relationship with God. For example, this would be a bit like if the ecclesial instruments were everything to us, it'd be a bit like going and doing our hall cleaning during the Bible class. Well, both are ecclesial activities, but you'll see the problem. And the problem that Jairus had was that he was a legalist. He was a legalist. He thought by a conscientious application of human ingenuity, he could save himself, that he could keep laws to be saved, and that as long as his family kept within certain rules, they'd be saved too. There's a problem with that. I mean, there's certainly a need for rules in life. Personal life, ecclesial life, there's a need for rules, but the rules of themselves, they might be barriers against bad behaviour, but of themselves they won't save us. There's something more. There's something more that's needed for salvation. And the Lord's going to extract that from him, you see, in this story. You think about it like this. This is something I've observed. The truth, often goes in circles or in cycles of 3 generations. And so there is a first generation Christadelphian. That would be the pioneer. That might be somebody who comes to the truth from outside. They find the truth. They make a difference between the truth and the world. They have a biblical principle for everything they do because they've had to, because they've made a difference. They've left something else behind. And therefore, they're very convinced and very committed. And they have children, and those children are the second generation. Well, they have much the same lifestyle as their parents, but they don't have the same quality of answers because, of course, the path's already been cleared. They don't have to fight for the same answers. They don't have the same conflicts, external or internal. And they are much lazier Bible students. And they have children. And those children are the third generation. And tragically, they don't have the same lifestyle or the same answers as the first generation. But they have entitlement. They think that they can do something different. They think that they know a better way. And they don't know really much at all, actually. And the key point of that story is to become a first-generation Christadelphian, because the fact of the matter is being a first-generation Christadelphian is a state of mind, not a state of birth. Any generation in the truth can be a first-generation Christadelphian by mentality. And that simply means having good answers, knowing what you do and knowing why you do it, and being able to transmit that charge to another generation so that they will know why they do what they do as well. That's the critical thing. The system won't necessarily teach you that. You've got to be an independent Bible student to accomplish that. And you're going to need a relationship with God to even have the commitment to do that. Well, Jairus comes to the Lord as the story goes on. And he asks that his little girl may be healed, it says in verse 23, that she may be healed. But the word healed doesn't really mean healed. He's not asking for her to be healed. He's asking for her to be saved. And that's what the word means. This word healed means to be saved. It's not the usual word for healing. It is the usual word for saving. Jairus actually knows the Lord Jesus Christ. Doesn't just know who he is. He actually knew something of him. Let me show you this. You come back with me to Mark chapter 1. Not so very long ago, you see, it tells us in Mark 1 and verse 21 that Jesus went to Capernaum. He went to Capernaum. And straightway on the Sabbath day, he entered into the synagogue and taught. So he's in the Capernaum synagogue in Mark 1:21. And they were astonished at his doctrine because he taught them as one that had authority and not as the scribes. And you'll recognize from our from the quotation on the screen, that it was the scribes who were the leaders, the expositors of that synagogue system, but they could never make a decision on their own. Well, the Lord teaches as one that has authority and not as the scribes. And There wouldn't have been anyone in that synagogue who recognized that contrast more than the ruler of the synagogue. And there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit, and he cried out. So this great wail ascends from the floor of the meeting. And verse 25 says, Jesus said, he rebuked him, saying, hold thy peace and come out of him. So authority from the platform, authority over disease. And then verse 28, immediately the Lord's fame spread abroad throughout all the region round about Galilee. So he becomes famous as a consequence of that miracle in the Capernaum synagogue. And everything looked wonderful. It looked like a great success on that day, but there was a problem. And the problem's in verse 21. It was the Sabbath day. It was the Sabbath day. And that was a problem. Now, nothing is said in this record, but it's noted. The fact that the Lord did this miracle on the Sabbath day was noted. And we know that because come to Mark chapter 3. One page over. Mark chapter 3 and verse 1. And he entered again into the synagogue. The synagogue. It's the same synagogue. Chapter 2 verse 1 says they're in Capernaum of Mark. Chapter 3 verse 1 we would presume they're still in Capernaum. He enters the synagogue and there was a man there with a withered hand and they watched him. Why? Whether he would heal him on the Sabbath day. Oh, it's another Sabbath day in the Capernaum synagogue. That they might accuse him, it says. So now everybody's watching him. And who more than the ruler of the synagogue would be watching to see what Jesus did? And he said to the man that had the withered hand, stand forth. And he says to them, is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath days or to do evil? To save life or to kill? But they held their peace. And this word save, where it says save life, the word save is the same word that you read in Mark chapter 5, verse 23, healed. Well, is it lawful to save life or not? Jesus says. And when he looked around about them with anger, being grieved for the hardness of their hearts, he said to the man, stretch forth thine hand, and he stretched it out, and his hand was restored whole as the other. Once again, the miracle's a success. But he was grieved because here they all were standing around watching this, all of them with two good hands. And this poor fellow, in this occasion in the synagogue, doesn't have that. And they're going to quote a point of law to prohibit that miracle. Well, this wasn't the only time the Lord healed on the Sabbath day. The Sabbath day is the seventh day, and it turns out in the gospel records there are 7 occasions when the Lord heals on the Sabbath day. And by putting the full gospel record side by side, you can see we've quoted Mark 1, we've quoted Mark 3, and in the story of Jairus, we're in Mark chapter 5. Mark 1 and Mark 3 both happened in the Capernaum synagogue. Jairus was there in Mark 1 and in Mark 3. But look at the reaction from the religious leaders to healings on the Sabbath day. And I'm quoting at the bottom of the screen there, John chapter 9. Therefore, John 9:16. Therefore said some of the Pharisees, this man is not of God because he keepeth not the Sabbath day. Verse 22 of the same chapter. Others said, how can a man that's a sinner do such miracles? And there was a division among them, for the Jews had already agreed that if any man did confess that he was the Christ, he should be put out of the synagogue. Now, isn't that interesting? They object to him healing on the Sabbath day. They're going to object even more to him healing in a synagogue on the Sabbath day. The fact that his miracles are successful in the face of Pharisees and scribes who couldn't do miracles like that divided the audience between those who thought he must be of God and those who thought he mustn't be because he was breaking the law in their eyes. If you believed him, you would be disfellowshipped, put out of the synagogue. So there's quite a lot of it at stake, therefore, for somebody like the ruler of the synagogue to have this sort of thing happening in his synagogue. And now he's got a little girl who's at the point of death. And he goes to the Lord in Mark chapter 5 and in verse 23 and asks if the Lord will save her. Look what he's jeopardizing by taking that position. Look what it could cost him to fall prostrate at the Lord's feet in Mark chapter 5. Now, it doesn't say in Mark chapter 5 that it was the Sabbath day. But if it was, I wonder how legal it would be now. I wonder how legal it would be now. You know what life's like, brothers and sisters. It's very easy to make rules for other people's kids. What about when we put the finger on yours? Wonder how legal it would be now, eh? But the fact is that Jairus has done a very faithful thing coming to the Lord. And when you see quotes like this from John 9 and you read what our last slide said about the culture of those days, you can see just what was at stake. Because you might ask me, why did he leave it so late? The kid's about to die, and only then does he come to Jesus Christ. Well, perhaps you can understand why he left it so late. There's a lot at stake for Jairus to be doing what he's doing. And whilst he's left it late, he, it appears, hasn't left it too late, because this story is going to have a happy ending, but not in the way he expects. Well, it tells us in verse 24 that Jesus went with him, and much people followed him and thronged him. So now Jesus is moving through an enormous crowd to make his way to Jairus' house. The word thronged in verse 24 means to compress. So the crowd's moving on all sides. Christ is a very popular figure. You can imagine the desperation of Jairus. I mean, time's of the essence for him. He wants to get the Lord to his house as quickly as possible. And the Lord's inching forward step by step at a fraction of walking speed because the crowd won't let him go any faster. And all Jairus wants to do is get home, and get home quickly. Because there's a little girl there, and every breath she breathes could be her last. He's a desperate man. And what happens next is almost unthinkable. I mean, it's the worst thing in the world. Verse 25. There was a certain woman which had an issue of blood 12 years. There's going to be a hold-up. There's going to be a hold-up. Now, here's a woman. Here's the next great character of the story. Here's a woman with a shocking condition. If Jairus enjoyed a certain elevation in Jewish social life because of his religious position, this woman enjoyed exactly the opposite. As far as the law was concerned, she was an outcast. In fact, as far as the law was concerned, her case was specifically legislated against. In Leviticus 15 and verse 25, it tells us, if a woman have an issue of blood many days, she shall be unclean. Every bed she lies on, wherever she sits, whatever she touches, shall be unclean. She's a social and a religious outcast. So we've got the two extremes of society, you see, between Jairus at the head of society and this woman at the bottom of society. And she's been in her situation, it tells us, for 12 years. 12 years. And by comparison with verse 42, you'll find that Jairus at the top of society and this woman at the bottom of society are linked by this little girl who lies dying because the little girl is 12 years old. Wow. That little girl's father's an important man. She's her parents' pride and joy. She's got more friends than you can count. And in contrast, this woman in verse 25, well, she spent 12 years avoiding people, standing on the edge of a crowd, unclean, the pride and joy of nobody at all. As far as the rabbis were concerned, her condition was grounds for divorce. And for 12 years, ever since his daughter was born, Jairus has said, as it were, to this woman, you can't come into my synagogue. You cannot come into my synagogue. Well, verse 26. She had suffered many things of many physicians. She had spent all that she had and was nothing better, but rather grew worse, it tells us. Rather grew worse. You know, you've got to think of the horror of those words. This is a very dignified age. So to read this is absolute cruelty. Many things of many physicians. Many things of many physicians, it tells us. She'd been conned out of every cent she'd ever owned. And in desperation, she'd sell the next possession to raise more money to go to the next doctor, only to pay another exorbitant fee and only to find it hopeless once again. She'd gone to everybody. Everybody knew of her. Not once, not twice, many times. Many times. And it's cost her everything. Mark says she'd spent all. Luke's record in Luke 8 in verse 43 says she'd spent all her living. You know, there's a little girl not so very far away who's also spent almost all her living. Her purse is empty too. Two women, you see, both at the extremity of life, one who's got no more money, the other who's got no more breath. 12 years each. Well, verse 27, when she heard of Jesus, she came in the press behind and touched his garment, for she said, if I may touch but his clothes, I shall be made whole. She knew she could never go to the synagogue. She could never ever meet Jesus there. All she knew was what she had heard about and what he had done elsewhere. And so she comes up behind him. She doesn't want to defile the crowd. She doesn't want publicity. She's desperate. She's just going to do one simple thing and touch his garment. Luke 8 and verse 44 says that she touched the border of his garment. She didn't just touch the garment, she touched the border of his garment. Matthew 9 and verse 20, she touched the hem of his garment. This is the ribbon of blue surrounding the bottom of the Lord's garment. All Jews had it. It was part of the law. But here's the thing about the ribbon of blue. It tells us the legal requirement to have this ribbon in Numbers chapter 15 and verse 38. The children of Israel had to make fringes in the borders of their garments, and that they had to put on the fringe of the borders a ribbon of blue, like a blue ribbon. It was a riband, but it was like a ribbon. That they might look upon it and remember all the commandments of Yahweh and do them, and seek not after their own heart and their own eyes. So that ribbon of blue basically symbolized to them that they were walking in the orbit of holiness. That was the significance. It was to be a daily reminder to keep the commandments of God. Well, of course, the Pharisees, who were perhaps the preeminent representatives of the law in Matthew 23, changed that to make a public statement. Matthew 23 and verse 5, it says, they did all their works to be seen of men. They made broad their phylacteries and enlarged the borders. So they had much bigger blue stripes around the bottom of their garments than anybody else did, as a public display. But you know, in the Old Testament, at the conclusion of the Old Testament, Malachi spoke of the same thing. He said in Malachi 4 verse 2, of the Messiah, unto you that fear my name shall the Son of Righteousness arise with healing in his border. It's the same word as in Numbers 15. Healing in his wings, that is, in his extremities, in his border. Well, perhaps that was the basis of the woman wanting to touch it here in Mark chapter 5, which she duly does. The consequence of her touching this is not just that she's healed, but the news travels far and wide, because the sequel, you might say, of what happens here in Mark 5 appears in Matthew 14. Matthew 14 is not the parallel record. Matthew 9 is the parallel record. Matthew 14. When they were gone over, they came to the land of Gennesaret. The men of that place besought the Lord that they might only touch the hem of his garment, and as many as touched were made perfectly whole. So this becomes famous, this story in Mark chapter 5 of the woman with the issue of blood. Well, it tells us that she touched him. And in verse 21, straightway the fountain of her blood was dried up, and she felt in her body that she is healed of that plague. And Jesus, immediately knowing in himself that virtue had gone out of him, turned him about in the press and said, "Who touched my clothes?" Virtue had gone out of him, it says in verse 29. The word virtue is the Greek dunamos, which means power, simply means power. And it's a reference here to physical power. It's not a reference to moral character or virtue in the conventional sense. It ought to be translated, power has gone out of him. The consequence of that power going out of him was that she was made whole in verse 28. The word whole is the same as the word healed in verse 23. It's the same as the word saved in Mark chapter 3. So she was saved by touching the hem of his garment, and power went from him to her as a consequence. What a moment it was. Under the law of Moses, she would have defiled him because of her uncleanness. In fact, the reverse occurred. He transmitted cleanness to her, and she was cured. But the Lord, of course, knew immediately what had happened. And he turns around. "Who touched me?" he says. "Who touched me?" Well, the answer comes back in verse 31. The disciples said to him, "Lord, what do you mean? What do you mean, who touched you? Thou seest the multitude thronging thee. Thou sayest, who touched me?" In fact, when you read Luke's account, it's Peter that began the answer to the Lord Jesus Christ. They all denied, and then Peter with the disciples, "Lord, thou seest the multitude. What do you mean? Who touched thee?" Jesus says, "Somebody touched me." We'll look at verse 32. And he looked around about him to see her that had done this thing. Stop. What does it say? He looked around about him to see her. It doesn't say he looked around about him to see who had done this thing. He looked around about him to see her that had done this thing. He looked straight at her. He knew who'd touched her. And he looked straight at her and found her immediately. But the woman, verse 33, fearing and trembling, knowing what was done in her, came and fell down before him and told him all the truth. She's trembling. Why is she trembling, do you suppose? Because the complaint's going to be made public? Don't think so. She'd already lost any shred of dignity she'd ever been born with. Because she defied the crowd? Don't think so. She's desperate. Mark tells us because she knew what was done in her. She knew a cure had been effected. And she must have felt that power pulse through her and immediately knew she'd found the cure she was looking for. And she knew, therefore, if she played games in verse 33, well, that cure might be reversed, mightn't it? So wouldn't you tremble in the face of that? She fell down before him, however, and told him the truth. Not just the truth, all the truth. Everything. What does that mean, all the truth? Her disease, her suffering, her unsuccessful treatments, the cost, her faith, what she had heard, why she did this, the cure. And there's a lesson there, isn't there? Salvation doesn't come for free. She's saved. She was made whole. She's made whole in verse 34. The same word occurs again. It's the word saved. Salvation doesn't come for free. What's the cost of salvation? Personal honesty. Personal honesty. When we say personal honesty, we mean all the truth. That means open every corridor in your mind and let the Lord look in. Every piece of life, nothing covered up, everything opened up. It's the only way to have a relationship with anybody. Complete personal honesty. All the truth. Everything. Because, of course, we can't save ourselves. And the system can't save us. The system of Christadelphia can't save us any more than the system of the Mosaic Code could save Jairus' daughter. But this can. But it requires complete personal confession. It requires all the truth. But as we say, it doesn't come for free. Salvation doesn't come for free. It's not hard, or it might be, but it ought not to be. But there's the cost of salvation. No good to try and slip back into the crowd and think that you've stolen salvation. Won't work. Didn't work here. The Lord's going to want to hear from us all the truth. And he says to her in verse 34, daughter, thy faith hath made thee whole. Thy faith hath saved thee. Go in peace and be whole of thy plague, he says. You know, that's the only time Jesus ever calls anyone his daughter. It's not the only time he uses the word daughter. You'll find in Luke 13 and verse 16, he calls another woman, a daughter of Abraham. But here he's calling her his daughter. You see, this is the Lord's only begotten daughter, isn't it? This is the Lord's only begotten daughter. No one else is called daughter like this. Almost as if power went from his body to hers and begat her. And as if to emphasize the point in verse 35, while he yet spake, there came from the ruler of the synagogue's house certain which says, thy daughter is dead. Why troublest the master any further? And you can hardly miss it. After 12 years, there was Jairus with an only begotten daughter, now dead, and standing before them, the only begotten daughter of the Lord Jesus Christ, now restored, as it were, to life. Now, how do you think Jairus would feel at this? Had this delay cost my little girl her life? I mean, wouldn't that be the first question that would come to mind? Why troublest thou the master any further? The messengers say. The word troublest in verse 35 means to whip, to flay, to strip. Rotherham's translation says, why further annoy the teacher? The point is that Jairus is almost dragging the Lord to his house. Every minute counts as far as Jairus is concerned. And to have this messenger come now and say that right at this moment would almost break his heart. I mean, as if to add insult to injury, the news of this woman's salvation comes in the same breath of the loss of his daughter as the loss of his daughter. It's almost swapped one for the other. Well, verse 36, Jesus knows this, of course. Jesus would know instantly what Jairus is thinking, and he speaks to him. As soon as Jesus heard the word that was spoken, he said to the ruler of the synagogue, be not afraid, only believe. This is a critical moment for Jairus, of course. Be not afraid, only believe. Now, in verse 36, the translation is not so good in the authorized version. The New International Version is better. Ignoring what they had said, Jesus told the synagogue ruler, don't be afraid, just believe. So he's telling them, forget it, he says, stay with me. We're going to your house. Stay with me. But as I say, a critical moment for Jairus, because he's got a dead body in his house now. And he's a man of the law, and the law is very, very clear on dead bodies as well. Numbers 19, verse 14. If he goes into that house, he will be unclean 7 days. But he's got no choice. He's going to have to go to the bedside of his daughter. He's going to have to bury his daughter. And so now you see the tables are turned. Because that weekend in the synagogue, the social outcast of 12 years, that woman will be there. And the ruler of the synagogue, who occupied the top echelon of Jewish society, would not be there. She was now clean and he would be unclean. So everything's been turned on its head as a consequence of the interaction of these people in this chapter. Well, verse 37. Jesus suffered no man to follow him, save Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. He comes to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and he sees the tumult and them that wept and wailed greatly. So the professional mourners have already come, almost like tow trucks to a breakdown, you know. They've already turned up. No shred of true emotion here. Verse 39, when he was come in, he said to them, Jesus said to them, why make ye this ado and weep? The damsel is not dead, but sleepeth. And they laughed him to scorn. But when he had put them all out, he taketh the father and the mother of the damsel, and them that were with him, and entering in where the damsel was lying, entered in where the damsel was lying. Now that's interesting. They laughed him to scorn. Shows two things. Shows the genuineness of their mourning, firstly, and proves that she was actually dead, secondly, doesn't it? Shows two things. So Jesus expels them with all the insincerity of Jewish tradition. And so now the last vestige of the synagogue system and all its accoutrements has now left this man's house. And who's in the room? Well, Jesus, it says. Peter, James, and John, it says. The little girl, the mother, the father. The father. Now that's interesting. Didn't I tell you? Jairus is mentioned by name at the start of the story, and he's never called Jairus again. What's he called? He's called the ruler of the synagogue. The ruler of the synagogue until here. And no more is he called the ruler of the synagogue. Now he's the father. You see? It's come right down to immediate family. It's just the father. He's a different man. He's no longer the ruler of the synagogue. It's just the father. And Jesus took the damsel by the hand and said to her, Talitha cumi, which is being interpreted, damsel, I say unto thee, arise. And straightway the damsel arose and walked, for she was of the age of 12 years, and they were astonished with a great astonishment. Well, as well they might have been. But here's the interesting thing. Talitha cumi, it says. Damsel, arise. The word cumi means arise. And it's ironic because Edisheim tells us that this word, this same word, was used by the rabbis for curing people of bleeding diseases. The rabbinical statement, as Edisheim tells us, is arise from thy flux. It was the standard rabbinical cure for bleeding. The very same words as Jesus uses here, except that that woman would have heard those words dozens of times without avail. And here, it's immediately successful. And not just for the staunching of bleeding, but for the salvation of life. Well, verse 43, Jesus charged them straightly that no man should know it, and they commanded that something should be given her to eat. Food, perhaps, a great proof of the resurrection. She's alive once more and she can eat and drink. And think of the sequel to this story. What might it be like the next Sabbath day? Well, once Jairus is, well, there's no more a dead body in the house, is there? So the next Sabbath day, there would have been a new face in that synagogue. Jairus would be there with his family, and a new face after 12 years of isolation should be there at the door. And Jairus had greeted her, knowing that there's a relationship now between he and this woman that they'd never had before. And she'd taught him something that he could never learn any other way. So what lessons do you suppose we might take from this story then, brothers and sisters? Well, the first is the obvious one. The system won't save you. Jairus ran a synagogue. He was devoted to it. He was wedded to it. But by its very nature, the synagogue system couldn't save him or his family any more than the system of Christadelphia can do us. That is, the systems in Christadelphia can save us. These are a means to an end to enable the truth to flourish. What will save us is a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. But that comes at a cost, and the cost is all the truth. And the moment we try and hide this part or that part of our life from the Lord's view will be the moment that the cure is reversed. Because he wants to hear all the truth. He wants a relationship, and therefore every door has got to be opened to enable that relationship. When we understand that, of course, we've got to teach it to our children. They might teach it to their children, that each generation might know the what and the why of how we live the truth, that together we all might be, at least in mind, if not in body, first generation Christadelphians. Thank you, Brother Chairman.